My name is Elena Voss, 34 years old, and for the last 3 months, I've been a federal district judge. But that Sunday evening, sitting across from my boyfriend's father, at their dining table, I was just the quiet girlfriend who smiled politely while he explained to me, in great detail, how the justice system actually works. He spoke with that particular kind of confidence some men have when they believe they're the only one in the room who's ever seen the real world. Not loud. Not cruel. Just patient. Slow. Like he was doing me a favor by sharing his hard-earned wisdom. By the time he finished his second glass of wine and leaned forward to tell me why federal judges had lost touch with justice, I had already eaten most of my salmon, complimented his wife on the rosemary chicken twice, and folded my napkin neatly in my lap. I looked him straight in the eyes and said very calmly, "That's an interesting perspective. I'll keep it in mind when I return to the courthouse on Monday." He laughed, a warm, dismissive chuckle. He thought I was joking, trying to be cute. I wasn't joking. If you've ever sat at a table where someone was unknowingly explaining your own profession to you, like you were a naive child who needed guidance, then you already understand the strange mix of amusement and heaviness I felt in that moment. Type the word underestimated if you know exactly what I'm talking about. Let me bring you back to the beginning so you can feel how we even ended up at that dinner table. 3 months earlier, I had been confirmed as one of the youngest federal judges in our circuit. The process was exhausting. Months of background checks, Senate hearings, sleepless nights reviewing case files that would decide people's futures. I had worked my way up from public defender to prosecutor to the bench, carrying the weight of every decision with me. At work, I was Judge Voss. Respected, careful, powerful in ways most people never see. But outside the courthouse, I was simply Elena. The woman who stress-baked bread at midnight, kept too many orchids on her windowsill, cried at predictable movie endings, and loved a man named Ryan who made me feel safe in a world that often wasn't. Ryan knew everything. He had held me through the anxiety of the nomination process. He understood the responsibility I carried every single day. But when it came to introducing me to his parents, he asked for one small favor. "Just this once," he said one evening while we were cooking together. "Can we let them meet Elena first? Not the judge, not the title, just you." I understood why he was asking. His father, Victor, was a retired federal prosecutor with 35 years of war stories and very strong opinions about activist judges who had supposedly ruined the system he spent his life defending. Ryan had grown up hearing those lectures. He wanted his dad to see the woman he loved before the armor of my profession changed everything. So I agreed. One dinner, no titles, just family. Looking back now, that decision led to one of the most important nights of my life. Because that evening, as Victor passionately explained the flaws of the federal bench to my face, I sat there in silence. Not because I was weak, but because I chose to be strategic. I wanted him to speak freely. I wanted to see the real man behind the reputation. And when the moment finally came to reveal who I truly was, everything changed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to the beginning of that Sunday, when Ryan and I drove toward his parents' house with autumn leaves swirling across the road, not knowing that by the end of the night, one of the most respected prosecutors of his generation would be apologizing to the woman he had just spent an hour lecturing. This is the story of how I learned that sometimes the most powerful move isn't to speak up immediately. Sometimes it's to listen, to wait, and to let the truth reveal itself with perfect timing. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who was supposed to welcome you, stay with me. This one goes deeper than you think. The road to that federal bench wasn't something I planned as a little girl. I grew up in a small town in upstate New York, the daughter of a high school teacher and a nurse. We didn't have money for fancy law schools or powerful connections. What we had was work ethic and a deep sense of fairness that my parents drilled into me from a young age. I still remember the first time I stepped into a courtroom as a college intern. It was messy, loud, and heartbreaking. A single mother was fighting to keep custody of her children while battling an aggressive prosecutor who seemed more interested in winning than in justice. I watched her lose that day, not because the law was against her, but because she didn't have the right voice in the room. That moment stayed with me. It lit a fire. I worked my way through law school on scholarships, part-time jobs, and pure determination. After graduating, I chose the hardest path first. I became a public defender. For 4 long years, I stood in courtrooms defending people society had already written off. I saw the system from the bottom up. The exhausted single parents, the scared kids who made one mistake, the addicts who needed treatment more than punishment. Those years taught me mercy in a way no classroom ever could. Then I switched sides. I joined the U.S. Attorney's Office as a prosecutor. Suddenly, I was the one carrying the weight of protecting the public. I learned how heavy that responsibility feels when you're standing across from a defendant's family, knowing your words could change their lives forever. The balance between justice and compassion became my daily struggle. By the time I was 31, I had built a reputation for being thorough, fair, and unflinching. When a federal judgeship opened in our district, several colleagues encouraged me to apply. I laughed at first. Me? Me? At 34? But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like the next step in the journey I had started in that chaotic courtroom years ago. The confirmation process was brutal. Months of interviews, background checks that dug into every corner of my life. Senate hearings where politicians tried to paint me as too young, too idealistic, or too soft. I stayed calm through all of it. I answered every question with honesty and preparation. When the final vote came through and I was confirmed, I cried in my car for 20 minutes before calling Ryan. He was the only person who truly understood what this meant. Not just the title, but the weight I would now carry every single day. Ryan had been with me through the late nights, the self-doubt, the fear that I wasn't ready. He watched me grow from a tired public defender into a woman who could sit on the bench and make decisions that affected hundreds of lives. But even with him, I kept one boundary clear. My professional life and my personal life stayed separate for a reason. I had seen too many colleagues have their personal relationships poisoned by the job, the constant questions, the arguments about cases, the way people suddenly treated them differently once they knew the title. That's why when Ryan asked me to meet his parents as just Elena, the attorney, I agreed. I wanted them to know me as a person first. I wanted a chance to sit at their table without the invisible robe weighing down the conversation. I thought it would be simple. One dinner, some polite conversation, maybe a few awkward questions about my law practice. I had no idea that Victor, with his 35 years as a federal prosecutor, would see me as the perfect audience for his strongly held views about everything wrong with the modern judiciary. I didn't know he would spend nearly an hour explaining how things really work to the one person in the room who lived those decisions every single day. Looking back, that choice to stay silent at the beginning wasn't weakness. It was preparation. It was me giving myself the chance to observe, to understand, and to choose the exact right moment to speak. Because when you've spent years learning how to read a room, how to listen for what people aren't saying, and how to carry heavy truths with quiet strength, you learn that timing is everything. And on that beautiful autumn Sunday, my timing was about to be perfect. Ryan and I had been together for almost 3 years by that point. He wasn't the flashy type. He was steady, thoughtful, the kind of man who remembered how I took my coffee after a long day in court and who would quietly handle dinner when I was buried in motions until midnight. As an environmental engineer, he understood pressure and responsibility in his own way. He restored wetlands, fought for environmental protections, and often dealt with bureaucratic systems that moved too slowly. He had seen me at my lowest, exhausted after losing a difficult case, overwhelmed during the nomination process, and quietly terrified that I wasn't experienced enough for the bench. Through all of it, Ryan never tried to fix me. He simply showed up. He listened. He reminded me why I started this journey in the first place. That's why his request about meeting his parents carried so much weight. We were standing in my kitchen one Thursday evening. I was reviewing briefs while he chopped vegetables for stir-fry. He set the knife down, turned to me, and said carefully, "My parents have been asking about you a lot lately. They want to meet you properly, but I was thinking, maybe we don't mention the judgeship right away." I looked up from my paper surprised. "Why?" Ryan rubbed the back of his neck, a habit he had when he was choosing his words carefully. "My dad, he's complicated. He's proud of his 35 years as a prosecutor. Really proud. He has very strong opinions about federal judges, especially younger ones. I just want him to meet you as Elena first, the woman I love, not Judge Voss." I understood the fear behind his words. I had heard enough stories about Victor to know he could be intense. Ryan had grown up watching his father dominate dinner conversations with stories of courtroom battles and criticisms of out-of-touch judges. He didn't want that energy directed at me, before his parents even had a chance to know the real person behind the title. I thought about it for a long moment. Part of me wanted to be fully seen from the beginning, but another part, the part that had spent years navigating rooms full of powerful men who assumed they knew more, understood the strategic value of silence. "Okay," I finally said. "One dinner. Just Elena, the attorney in private practice, but Ryan, if it comes up naturally, I won't lie." He looked relieved. He pulled me into a hug and kissed the top of my head. "Thank you. I think they're going to love you. How could they not?" That night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if I was making the right choice. I had worked so hard to earn my seat on the bench. Hiding it felt strange, almost like diminishing myself. But I also knew how titles change rooms. I had experienced it firsthand, the sudden stiffness, the careful wording, the way people either became overly formal or overly argumentative. I wanted Victor and Margaret to meet the woman who burned toast on Sunday mornings, who cried during commercials sometimes, and who still got nervous before big rulings. I wanted them to know Elena before they met the judge. Ryan sensed my hesitation in the days leading up to the dinner. He kept reassuring me, "Just be yourself. That's more than enough." On the drive to his parents' house, that Sunday afternoon, the autumn scenery was beautiful. Red and gold leaves dancing across the road. But Ryan's hands were tight on the steering wheel. I reached over and squeezed his knee. "You're overthinking this," I said gently. He gave me a small smile. "Maybe, but Dad can be a lot. Just remember, whatever happens, I'm on your side." I nodded, but inside I was already preparing myself. I didn't know it then, but that dinner would test everything I had learned about patience, power, and the courage it takes to stay silent when every part of you wants to speak. As we pulled into the long driveway lined with maple trees, I took a deep breath. One dinner. Just Elena. I had no idea how wrong that assumption would turn out to be. The colonial-style house sat at the end of a quiet, tree-lined street. Golden autumn light filtered through the maples, casting warm patterns across the perfectly manicured lawn. As Ryan parked the car, I took a slow breath, smoothing down my simple navy dress. I had chosen something professional but warm, nothing that screamed courtroom. Victor opened the front door before we even reached the porch steps. He was exactly as Ryan had described. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair at the temples and the kind of commanding presence that still filled courtrooms even in retirement. His handshake was firm, almost testing, as his sharp blue eyes quickly assessed me. "Elena," he said, his voice deep and measured. "We've heard quite a bit about you. Welcome." Margaret appeared right behind him, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She was smaller, with kind eyes and a warm smile that immediately put me at ease. She pulled me into a gentle hug. "I'm so glad you're finally here. Ryan has been talking about you for months." The house smelled incredible. Rosemary roasted chicken, fresh bread, and something sweet baking in the oven. The living room was classic and comfortable, with dark wood bookshelves packed with legal biographies, history books, and framed photos of Victor, receiving various awards throughout his career. One large frame near the fireplace showed him shaking hands with a former attorney general. We moved into the dining room, where the table was beautifully set with cloth napkins, good china, and candles already lit. Margaret clearly took pride in hosting. Ryan helped carry dishes from the kitchen while I offered to help, but she waved me off with a smile. "Guests, sit and relax, dear." Victor sat at the head of the table, naturally taking the position of authority. I sat across from him. With Ryan beside me, the first 25 minutes were surprisingly pleasant. Margaret asked about where I grew up and how Ryan and I met. I kept my answers light and warm, talking about our first date at a small Italian restaurant where Ryan accidentally spilled wine on his shirt. Victor listened quietly at first, nodding along. But I could feel him studying me, waiting for the right opening. When the conversation naturally turned toward careers, he leaned forward slightly. "So, Elena," he said, cutting into his chicken, "Ryan mentioned you're an attorney. What kind of work do you focus on these days?" I smiled calmly. "Mostly litigation. I work closely with the court system." He nodded, seeming satisfied with the vague answer. "Private practice, then?" "Something like that," I replied, keeping my tone even. For a little while, the conversation shifted comfortably to Ryan's latest environmental project, restoring a local wetland area. Margaret asked thoughtful questions, and Victor listened with the patient expression of a man waiting for the discussion to return to more interesting territory. Meaning the law. I could feel the shift coming. Victor refilled his wine glass and leaned back in his chair, his eyes settling on me with growing interest. "You know," he began, "I always tell young lawyers that what they teach in law school is only half the story. The real work happens in the trenches." Ryan shot me a quick, apologetic glance. I gave him a tiny, reassuring smile and turned my attention back to Victor. This was the moment I had prepared for. I settled into my seat, kept my expression open and interested, and let him speak. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply listen and wait. The food was excellent, the company polite, but I could already sense the undercurrent. Victor wasn't just making conversation. He was building toward something, and I was ready. Victor took a slow sip of wine, then set his glass down with the deliberate care of a man who knew how to command attention. The candlelight flickered across his face as he looked directly at me. "You see, Elena," he began, his voice taking on that deep, authoritative tone, "the law isn't what they teach you in those fancy classrooms. It's not just theories and precedents. Real justice is about people. Victims. Defendants. Families whose lives are changed forever by the decisions made in that courtroom." I nodded politely, maintaining eye contact. "I think that's very true." He seemed pleased by my response and continued, warming to his subject. A lot of young attorneys today lose sight of that, especially on the federal side. Prosecutors get lost in procedures and plea deals. Defense attorneys hide behind constitutional arguments. And the judges. He shook his head slowly, more in sorrow than anger. The judges have become too insulated, too detached from the real world. Margaret quietly said his name, a gentle warning, but Victor waved it off with a small chuckle. I'm just having a conversation, dear. Ryan shifted uncomfortably beside me, but I placed my hand lightly on his knee under the table, signaling that I was okay. I wanted to hear this. Victor leaned forward, gesturing with his fork. I spent 35 years in those courtrooms. I built cases from the ground up. I looked victims in the eye. I made sure justice wasn't just some abstract concept. But these days, federal judges who've never tried a real case in front of a jury are making decisions that affect real lives. They sit behind their walls of clerks and procedures, far removed from the consequences. He paused, looking at me as if expecting agreement. You work in litigation. You've seen it, I'm sure. The system has gotten soft, too political, too academic. I took a small sip of water, choosing my response carefully. It sounds like you've seen a lot of changes over the years. Oh, I have, he continued, gaining momentum. When I started, judges understood the weight of their position. They felt it every day. Now, many of them come straight from big law firms or academia. They've never had to stand in a courtroom and fight for justice. They don't understand what it really feels like, that heavy responsibility when a family is watching you, waiting for you to do what's right. The table had grown quieter. Margaret focused on her plate. Ryan was tense beside me. But I remained calm, listening intently, absorbing every word. Inside, I felt a strange mixture of emotions, not anger, but a deep, quiet clarity. Every criticism he leveled was something I had wrestled with personally for years. Victor went on for nearly 20 more minutes, sharing specific examples from his career. Cases he had won, rulings he believed were overturned wrongly by appellate courts, and his frustration with what he called ivory tower justice. He spoke with genuine passion, the kind that comes from decades of believing in something deeply. He wasn't trying to be cruel. In his mind, he was educating me. A young woman, he assumed, was still finding her way in the legal world. I listened to every point. I noted the pain behind some of his words, the pride in others, and through it all, I kept my expression respectful and engaged. Because I understood something Victor didn't yet realize. I wasn't just hearing his lecture. I was studying the man. I was learning exactly who he was before I revealed who I truly was. As he paused to take another sip of wine, clearly proud of the wisdom he had shared, I felt a quiet strength settle over me. The moment was approaching. But not yet. Not quite yet. Victor was fully in his element now. His voice carried that measured authority that must have intimidated countless witnesses over the decades. He refilled his wine glass once more and continued, completely unaware of the storm he was creating in his own dining room. Let me give you a real example, he said, pointing his fork slightly in my direction. I had a major fraud case years ago. Solid evidence. Clear victims. The trial was textbook. But then an appellate judge, some young appointee with more theory than courtroom experience, overturned key evidence on a technicality. Years of work, gone. Families who deserved justice left empty-handed. That's what happens when the bench loses touch with reality. Ryan tried to intervene gently. Dad, maybe we can talk about something else. But Victor barely paused. No. Elena works in this world. She should hear this. The problem with the federal bench today is the appointment process itself. Too many people who've never had to look a victim in the eyes or stand in front of a jury. They make decisions from behind layers of clerks and briefs insulated from the human cost. I could feel the tension radiating from Ryan beside me. His jaw was tight. Margaret kept glancing between her husband and me with quiet concern. Yet I remained perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, my expression attentive and respectful. Inside, though, my mind was sharp and clear. Every word Victor spoke landed with weight because I had lived the other side of those stories. I had been the public defender fighting those technicalities to protect someone's constitutional rights. I had been the prosecutor building airtight cases. And now, as a judge, I carried the responsibility of making sure those technicalities served justice rather than obstructing it. Victor's voice grew more passionate. The law should feel heavy. When you're making a decision that changes lives, it should keep you up at night. Too many modern judges don't carry that weight. They're too far removed, too academic, too soft. He shook his head. I've seen it too many times. Judges who treat the courtroom like an intellectual exercise instead of the serious battlefield it truly is. The room felt smaller with each passing minute. The delicious food on our plates had gone mostly untouched. Ryan looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him. But I stayed calm. I nodded at the right moments. I asked a gentle follow-up question here and there to keep him talking. Not because I agreed, but because I wanted him to empty the entire reservoir of his assumptions about me. I wanted him to say everything he truly believed, without filter, without knowing he was speaking directly to the very person he was criticizing. There was a strange kind of power in that silence, not passive, not weak. It was deliberate, strategic. The same kind of patience I had learned to exercise in court when facing aggressive attorneys who thought they could rattle me. Victor spoke for nearly 40 minutes in total. By the end, he was leaning back in his chair, satisfied with the wisdom he had shared, completely convinced that he had educated the young girlfriend of his son about the realities of the legal world. He looked at me with something almost like paternal approval. You seem like a smart young woman, Elena. I hope you'll take some of this to heart in your practice. I met his gaze steadily. The moment had arrived. I set my fork down very gently, folded my hands, and spoke in the same calm, measured voice I used when delivering rulings from the bench. Victor, I have taken every word to heart. I looked directly at Victor, my voice steady and calm, carrying the same quiet authority I used in the courtroom. I've taken every word to heart because I live with that weight every single day. The clerks bring me the briefs the night before. I read them multiple times, sometimes 3 or 4, because I know the families on both sides are counting on me to get it right. Victor's expression shifted slightly, but he hadn't fully connected the dots yet. I continued evenly. When I hand down a sentence or rule an emotion, I feel that heaviness you described. It's supposed to be there. It keeps me careful. It keeps me honest. The table had gone completely silent. Even the candles seemed to flicker more quietly. I was confirmed 3 months ago, I said. Federal District Court. I'm the sitting judge for this district, and I'm currently presiding over the Meridian financial fraud case. The one your old firm represented the lead defendants on. For a moment, no one moved. Victor stared at me. The color slowly drained from his face as the realization hit him like a physical blow. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Ryan exhaled sharply, as if he had been holding his breath for the entire dinner. You're Judge Voss, Victor said, his voice barely above a whisper. The confident prosecutor who had dominated the conversation for nearly an hour suddenly looked smaller in his own dining room. Yes, I replied simply, I am. The silence that followed was heavy. Victor's eyes moved rapidly as he mentally replayed every single word he had said to me over the past hour, every criticism of federal judges, every condescending explanation, every assumption about my experience. I just spent nearly an hour. His voice trailed off. He rubbed a hand across his jaw, clearly shaken, explaining the federal judiciary to a sitting federal judge. Margaret reached over and touched his arm gently. Ryan looked between us, ready to step in if needed, but I gave him a small reassuring nod. Victor stared down at the tablecloth for a long moment. When he finally looked up, his expression was a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and something deeper: respect. "How old are you?" he asked quietly. It wasn't rude. It was the question of a man trying to recalibrate everything he thought he knew. 34, I answered. He absorbed that. One of the youngest in the circuit. I've heard that, I said softly. Victor pushed his chair back slightly and stared at the remains of his dinner. For the first time that evening, the larger-than-life prosecutor seemed to occupy less space than the chair he sat in. "Why didn't you say something earlier?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. I smiled gently, because I wanted you to meet me first. Not the robe, not the title, just Elena. The honesty in my words seemed to hit him hard. He nodded slowly, processing. I could see the internal battle playing out across his face, the pride of a man who had built his identity on being right, clashing with the integrity of someone who valued truth above ego. Ryan finally spoke, his voice quiet. "Dad, I wanted you to know her as a person first." Victor looked at his son, then back at me. The weight of the moment settled over all of us. In that silence, something important shifted in the room. The power dynamic had completely changed, not through shouting or confrontation, but through quiet truth. And I sat there, calm and steady, exactly as I had been trained to be on the bench. Because sometimes the most powerful rulings aren't delivered with force. They're delivered with timing. Victor sat motionless for several long seconds, the weight of his earlier words hanging heavily in the air between us. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, stripped of its earlier authority. "I owe you an apology, Elena," he said. The words came out slowly, deliberately, the way a man who valued integrity spoke when he knew he had made a serious mistake. "I made assumptions about you from the moment. Ryan mentioned you were a lawyer. I spent this entire evening being condescending. And I was wrong." I met his gaze steadily. "You don't have to." "No," he interrupted firmly, but not unkindly. "I do. I've spent 35 years telling young prosecutors never to walk into a room with their minds already made up. And tonight, in my own home, I did exactly that." Margaret watched her husband with quiet pride and relief. Ryan remained still beside me, letting this moment unfold naturally. Victor continued, rubbing his hand across his jaw. "I stand by many of my criticisms of the system, but I should have asked about your experience first instead of assuming. That was my failure tonight." I nodded once, acknowledging the weight of his words. I was a public defender for 4 years before becoming a prosecutor. I've seen the system from both sides. The pain of victims and the struggles of the accused. The weight you talked about, I feel it every single day I put on that robe. Something shifted in Victor's expression. Genuine respect mixed with surprise. Public defender to the bench. That's not an easy path. It wasn't, I admitted. But it prepared me. Every late night, every difficult case, every time I had to stand up for someone the system wanted to discard, it all led me here. We talked then, really talked. Victor asked real questions about my approach to sentencing, about how I balanced accountability with mercy, about the cases that kept me up at night. I answered honestly, sharing stories from my time on the bench and the lessons I had learned. He listened, actually listened. For the first time that evening, the conversation felt like one between equals, rather than a lecture. At one point, he shook his head slowly. "I criticize judges who've never stood in the trenches. And here you are, someone who has. I was so busy protecting what I built that I stopped seeing clearly. His apology wasn't quick or superficial. It was thoughtful. Earned. The kind of apology that costs a man like Victor something real. I'm truly sorry, Elena, he said, looking me directly in the eyes. For underestimating you. For assuming. For turning what should have been a welcoming dinner into this. I reached across the table and briefly touched his hand. Thank you, Victor. I accept your apology. And I appreciate you being willing to see me differently. The tension in the room began to ease. Margaret smiled softly and stood to bring out dessert. A warm apple crumble that filled the house with cinnamon and comfort. As we ate, the conversation shifted to lighter topics. But the respect between Victor and me had fundamentally changed. Before we left that night, Victor walked us to the door. He shook my hand again, this time not as a test, but as one colleague to another. I hope we can do this again, he said. Properly this time. I smiled. I'd like that. As Ryan and I drove home under the starlit autumn sky, he reached over and squeezed my hand. You were incredible tonight, he whispered. I leaned my head back against the seat, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a long-held truth finally revealed. Not with anger, not with triumph, but with grace. That night taught me something powerful. Sometimes the strongest response isn't immediate correction. Sometimes it's patient listening, followed by undeniable truth delivered with quiet strength. 2 weeks later, my clerk knocked on my chamber door during a break between hearings. Judge Voss, there's a Mr. Victor Whitmore on the line. He says it's personal. I felt a small flutter of surprise, but asked her to put him through. When I picked up, Victor's voice was quieter than I remembered. Elena Judge Voss, he corrected himself with a small, self-deprecating chuckle. I've been thinking about that dinner, a lot. We spoke for nearly 40 minutes, not as prosecutor and judge, but as two people who had spent their lives in the same system trying to do what they believed was right. He told me about cases from his final years that still bothered him. Situations where identical facts produced wildly different outcomes, depending on which judge presided. I shared my own struggles with sentencing consistency and the heavy responsibility of discretion. Before we hung up, he said something I'll carry with me for a long time. I was wrong about you. And more importantly, I think you're going to be an excellent judge. The kind this system needs. His words meant more than any public compliment ever could. A month after the first dinner, we returned to their house. Margaret made the same rosemary chicken. Intentionally, she later admitted, as a way to rewrite the memory of that difficult evening. This time, the atmosphere was completely different. Victor asked real questions, thoughtful ones. He wanted to know about the cases I found most challenging, about how I navigated public pressure, about what I believed the role of a judge should truly be. We disagreed on certain policies, particularly around mandatory minimums, but we argued like colleagues who respected each other's experience. Ryan sat between us, visibly more relaxed, occasionally chiming in with humor that made both Victor and me laugh. Margaret watched with quiet satisfaction, the peacekeeper who had seen her husband grow. After dinner, Victor and I ended up on the back porch. The October air had turned cooler. He stood with his hands in his pockets, looking out into the dark yard. I owe you more than an apology, he said quietly. I owe you respect. You showed more grace that night than I deserved. I smiled softly. We all make assumptions sometimes. What matters is what we do after we realize them. He nodded. You taught my son something important that night too. About strength, about patience. About being secure enough in who you are that you don't need to prove it immediately. We stood in comfortable silence for a while. Then he turned to me. I'm proud to know you, Elena. Not just as Ryan's girlfriend, as Judge Voss, as the woman who handled my foolishness with dignity. That second dinner marked the beginning of a new chapter. Victor became someone I could call when I needed perspective from the prosecution side. Our relationship grew into one of mutual respect and occasional lively debate, the kind that makes both people better. As Ryan and I drove home that night, I looked out at the passing autumn trees and felt a deep sense of peace. Not because I had won anything, but because I had stayed true to myself. I had chosen patience over point scoring, dignity over humiliation, truth over easy victory. And in doing so, I gained something far more valuable than a successful dinner. I gained real understanding. That experience taught me something profound about power, patience, and what real strength looks like. In that first dinner, I could have corrected Victor the moment he started lecturing. I could have used my title like a weapon and made him feel small in front of his own family. Many people would have said I had every right to do exactly that. But rights and wisdom aren't always the same thing. I chose to listen, not out of fear or weakness, but out of clarity. I wanted him to know me, the real me, before the title changed everything. And in that space of patience, something honest and meaningful was able to grow. If you've ever been underestimated at a family table, dismissed in your own home, or forced to prove your worth to people who should have seen it already, I want you to remember this. Your silence can be strategic. Your calm can be powerful. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is wait for the exact right moment to speak your truth with quiet dignity. Real power doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to humiliate. It simply needs to be ready. Victor and I continue to have a respectful relationship today. We don't always agree, but we listen to each other, and Ryan is proud of both of us for the way we handled that difficult beginning. So if this story touched something in you tonight, I hope you'll carry this with you. Stay calm. Stay prepared. Stay true to who you are. The right people will eventually see you clearly. Type quiet strength in the comments if this resonated with you. I read every single one, and your stories matter to me. Thank you for sitting with me through this. If you're facing your own version of that dinner table right now, know that you are stronger than you think. You've got this. Until next time, take care of yourselves.